You have probably never thought of yourself as someone who could be controlled. You are perceptive, you read people well, you catch lies before they fully form, and you see through performances that fool everyone else in the room. And yet, if you are being completely honest with yourself, there have been moments, specific uncomfortable moments, where you walked away from a conversation feeling smaller than when you entered it. Where you agreed to something you never intended to agree to. Where you apologized for something that was never your fault. Where you spent 3 hours lying awake trying to figure out how a person with half your intelligence managed to make you feel guilty, confused, and somehow responsible for their chaos. That feeling is not a coincidence. It is not weakness. It is the result of a very specific game being played against you. A silent game. One that has no rulebook, no declared players, and no obvious beginning. By the time you realize you are in it, you have usually already lost several rounds. Niccolo Machiavelli spent his life watching this game being played in the most dangerous courts in the world. Renaissance Florence was not a place for the sentimental. Leaders rose and fell, not because of justice or talent, but because of who understood human nature more precisely than their enemies. Machiavelli was not a villain. He was an observer of extraordinary clarity, and what he observed across decades of political life was something that contradicts almost everything we are taught about power and intelligence. The people who controlled others were rarely the sharpest. They were rarely the most educated, the most competent, or the most composed. They were often desperate, emotionally volatile, impulsive. They lied clumsily, contradicted themselves constantly, and operated not from calculated strategy, but from survival instinct. And yet, they won, not because they outsmarted their opponents, but because they understood one thing their opponents did not. The battlefield was never logic. It was always emotion. Here is the first thing you need to understand. Intelligence, the kind that processes information carefully, weighs evidence honestly, and builds internally consistent arguments, is only an advantage in environments that reward those things. In a courtroom with a fair judge, in a scientific debate with honest peers, in a negotiation between two parties who both want resolution, intelligence wins almost every time. But in a relationship where one person is not trying to resolve anything, in a workplace where one colleague is not trying to be fair, in a family dynamic where one member has no interest in honesty, intelligence does not just become less useful. It becomes a weapon pointed in the wrong direction. Machiavelli wrote that people are more likely to forget the death of a parent than the loss of an inheritance. When he wrote this, he was not trying to be cruel. He was making a methodological point. If you want to understand human behavior, stop studying what people say motivates them and start studying what actually moves them. Fear moves them. Desire moves them. The terror of losing status, resources, love, or safety moves them. Reason, by comparison, is a thin and fragile layer sitting on top of a much older and much more powerful architecture, and the manipulator, almost always by instinct rather than design, knows how to reach underneath that layer and pull. You have been trained your entire life to engage with the layer on top. You were rewarded in school for constructing logical arguments. You were praised for staying calm in conflict. You were told that the mature response to chaos was patience, that the ethical response to aggression was compassion, and that the intelligent response to contradiction was to simply present the evidence more clearly. Every single one of these instincts, in the presence of someone playing the silent game, is a disadvantage. Think about what happens when you enter a conflict with someone who operates this way. Your first instinct is to understand them. You replay the interaction in your mind, searching for the moment things went wrong, asking yourself whether you missed something, whether you were unclear, whether you contributed to the problem in a way you are not yet seeing. This is not weakness. This is what a sophisticated mind does. It turns the lens on itself because it knows that the self is the only variable it can control with certainty, but the manipulator is not doing any of this. While you are examining yourself, they are already moving on to the next maneuver. While you are trying to understand a conflict, they are creating the next one. While you are building a case, they have already changed the charges. Machiavelli watched this happen to capable men repeatedly throughout his career. He watched intelligent diplomats get outmaneuvered not by cleverer diplomats, but by more chaotic ones, men whose unpredictability was itself a strategy, men who used emotional volatility the way a general uses terrain. If the field is muddy enough, the better trained army loses its footing. You do not need superior soldiers. You just need to make the ground unstable. And that is precisely what the low awareness manipulator does to the high intelligence target. They make the ground unstable. They shift positions without explanation. They introduce moral charges that are difficult to immediately disprove. They perform injury with enough conviction that your empathy activates before your judgment does. They create a version of events in which you are the problem, and they do it with enough emotional intensity that even you begin to wonder if they might be right. This is the silent game. It has no name in most households. It is not taught in schools. It does not appear in most self-help books, because most self-help books are written for the person who wants to improve, and the manipulator has no such interest. But Machiavelli named it, not in those words, but in the underlying logic. He understood that the weak, when they cannot compete through legitimate means, will always seek to reshape the environment until their weaknesses become advantages. And the most reliable way to do that is to make the encounter emotional, ambiguous, and morally charged, because these are conditions in which analytical intelligence is nearly blind. There is a specific moment in every manipulative dynamic where the target makes a critical error. It is not the moment they first get deceived. It is not even the moment they begin to doubt themselves. It is the moment they decide that the solution to what is happening is more understanding, more patience, more careful explanation, more generosity of interpretation. Because in that moment they have accepted the manipulator's framing entirely. They have agreed, without realizing it, that the problem is a communication problem, that the conflict is a misunderstanding problem, that if only the right words were found, and the right tone was struck, and the right amount of empathy were extended, resolution would follow. Machiavelli would have recognized this error immediately. He spent years watching intelligent, principled men make it inside the courts of Florence and Rome and beyond. They believed that good faith, clearly demonstrated, would eventually produce good faith in return. They believed that if they showed their cards honestly enough, the other party would feel compelled by some social or moral gravity to do the same. What they failed to understand, and what Machiavelli documented with almost clinical precision, is that this compulsion only exists between people who share the same operating system, between people who both believe that honesty is its own reward, that fairness matters intrinsically, that reputation is built through consistency rather than performance. When one party does not share these values, extending them does not create reciprocity. It creates exposure. This is the engine of the silent game, not cruelty, not calculated evil, something far more mundane and far more dangerous. The manipulator is simply operating by a different set of rules, rules that were usually formed not through deliberate philosophy, but through survival, through childhood environments where honesty was punished and performance was rewarded, through relationships where vulnerability was weaponized, through years of learning that the direct path to anything desirable was blocked, and that the only reliable route ran through other people's emotions. They are not masterminds, they are survivors of a particular kind of emotional poverty, and they have become extraordinarily efficient at one narrow skill: locating and pulling the specific levers that keep other people off balance. And here is what makes this so difficult to see clearly when you are inside it. The manipulation is almost never constant. It does not arrive as a sustained assault that you can recognize and brace against. It arrives in intervals. In between the destabilizing moments are periods of warmth, humor, apparent vulnerability, and genuine seeming connection. Machiavelli understood the strategic value of this rhythm. He wrote about the necessity of knowing when to be the lion and when to be the fox. The lion commands through force. The fox commands through appearances. The most effective operator knows how to move between these modes, and the manipulator, usually without ever reading a single line of political philosophy, has learnt this rhythm through pure instinct. The warmth is not fake in any simple sense. That is the part that makes intelligent people question their own perception. Because the warmth feels real, Because the connection in those intervals feels genuine, the target spends enormous mental energy trying to reconcile two versions of the same person. The version that made them feel seen and valued, and the version that made them feel confused, guilty, and small. They tell themselves that the second version must be a misreading, because the first version felt so real. They construct elaborate explanations for the difficult behavior. Stress, childhood wounds, fear of abandonment, external pressure. And many of these explanations may in fact be accurate. But here is what Machiavelli understood that the compassionate target does not yet see. An accurate explanation is not the same as a safe situation. You can understand exactly why a fire burns without being any less burned by it. Comprehension does not equal protection, and in the economy of the silent game, every moment you spend generating compassionate explanations for behavior that is harming you is a moment you are not spending protecting yourself. The manipulator does not need you to be foolish, they need you to be fair. Fairness in an unfair dynamic is a resource being extracted from you. Machiavelli wrote extensively about the concept of vert, a word that in his vocabulary did not mean virtue in the moral sense, but something closer to effective capability, the capacity to read a situation accurately and respond to it in a way that produces the desired outcome. He contrasted this with fortuna, the force of circumstances beyond control. His argument was not that the world was just or that good people prevailed, but that those who survived and flourished were those who developed an accurate map of the terrain they were actually navigating, not the terrain they wished they were navigating. The terrain of the manipulative dynamic is not a debate, it is not a negotiation. It is not a misunderstanding awaiting clarification. It is a system designed, however unconsciously, to keep you reactive, self-doubting, and emotionally occupied. Every attempt to resolve it through more honesty, more patience, more carefully worded conversations feeds the system. It does not disrupt it. Because resolution is not the goal of the other party. Influence is. Control is. The perpetuation of a dynamic in which their emotional states determine the atmosphere of the relationship and your energy is spent managing those states rather than pursuing your own clarity and direction. This is where Machiavelli's framework becomes genuinely useful in a way that most readings of his work miss entirely. People read Machiavelli and extract lessons about how to be ruthless, how to project strength, how to dominate. But the deeper lesson, the one that emerges from his observations of human psychology rather than his prescriptions for rulers, is about perception, about developing what he considered the rarest and most valuable capacity a person could possess in a world governed by appearances and concealed motives, the capacity to see what is actually happening rather than what you are being told is happening or what you would prefer to be happening. In the context of the silent game, this means something specific and uncomfortable. It means learning to separate intention from impact, learning to stop asking why someone is behaving in a harmful way and start asking whether the behavior itself, regardless of its origin, is something you can afford to keep absorbing. It means developing what might be called a Machiavellian empathy, not the cold removal of feeling, but the discipline to feel and observe simultaneously, to care about someone without surrendering your judgment to that care. The intelligent person's greatest vulnerability is not that they are too smart to be manipulated. It is that they are too committed to fairness to stop extending good faith past the point where good faith has been clearly exhausted. They keep returning to the question of what they are missing, what they misunderstood, what they failed to communicate clearly enough. And in doing so, they remain in a position of perpetual self-examination while the other party operates without any such constraint at all. Machiavelli saw this asymmetry clearly. He understood that in any conflict between someone with strong ethical commitments and someone without them, the person with ethical commitments is operating under a heavier burden, not because ethics are wrong, but because ethics require consistency, and consistency in an inconsistent environment is a form of exposure. The way out is not to abandon ethics. It is to understand clearly what kind of environment you are in, because ethics deployed in the wrong environment do not produce justice. They produce exploitation. So what does protection actually look like? Not the kind that requires you to become cold, suspicious, or permanently defended against everyone you encounter. Not the kind that turns every relationship into a threat assessment, but the real, functional kind. The kind that Machiavelli was pointing toward when he argued that the greatest political skill was not aggression or cunning, but accurate perception followed by appropriate response. What does it look like to see the silent game clearly enough that it loses its power over you? The first thing to understand is that recognition is not the same as accusation. You do not need to confront someone with a diagnosis of their manipulative behavior in order to stop being affected by it. In fact, direct confrontation is often exactly what the silent game is designed to produce, because confrontation creates a stage, and on that stage the manipulator is almost always more comfortable than you are. They have no investment in appearing reasonable. You do. They have no discomfort with escalation. You do. They can say things they do not mean, walk them back, reframe the entire interaction, and emerge looking like the wounded party, while you stand there holding evidence that somehow feels less solid than it did 5 minutes ago. Machiavelli understood this. He wrote that the wise man does not always show what he knows. Revealing the full extent of your perception is not the same as using it effectively. What effective use of perception looks like in practice is quieter and more powerful than confrontation. It looks like stopping the internal negotiations you are conducting with yourself every time you feel confused by someone's behavior. The intelligent person, when faced with inconsistency, automatically begins generating explanations. This is the mind doing what it is designed to do. It hates incoherence. It will work tirelessly to construct a framework in which the other person's behavior makes sense, in which your discomfort is explicable, in which the situation has a logic you can engage with. But sometimes behavior does not have an explanation that is useful to you. Sometimes the most accurate and actionable conclusion is simply this: this pattern is harmful. I am less clear-headed, less confident, and less myself in this dynamic. That observation does not require a cause. It does not require a psychological history of the other person. It does not require you to prove intention. It only requires you to trust what your own experience is consistently telling you. Machiavelli's concept of the effective ruler was someone who did not wait for absolute certainty before acting. He understood that in a world of incomplete information and concealed motives, waiting for proof was itself a strategy that favoured the person with nothing to prove. The person who demands evidence of manipulation before adjusting their behaviour is already playing by rules that serve the manipulator, because the manipulator will never provide clean evidence. The entire architecture of the silent game is designed to ensure that every harmful behaviour has a plausible, innocent explanation, that every instance of cruelty can be reframed as vulnerability, and that every attempt to name the pattern can be turned into evidence of your own instability or paranoia. This is why Machiavelli placed so much emphasis on what he called prudence, not caution in the timid sense, but the capacity to read patterns across time rather than evaluating each instant in isolation. A single, confusing conversation proves nothing. A pattern of confusing conversations that consistently leaves you feeling diminished, responsible for problems you did not create, and uncertain of your own perception is not a mystery to be solved. It is information to be acted upon. Prudence means trusting the pattern even when each individual data point can be explained away. It means understanding that the sum of a series of individually defensible behaviors can still constitute a system of harm. The second element of real protection is understanding what you are actually defending. Most intelligent people, when they sense manipulation, focus their energy on defending their position, their argument, their version of events. They want to establish that they are right, that their account is accurate, that the charges against them are unfair, and they will pursue this with tremendous energy and sophistication, building cases, gathering evidence, constructing timelines. But this is exactly the terrain on which the manipulator is most comfortable, because on this terrain the conversation is about facts and interpretations and who said what, and on that terrain the manipulator has no commitment to accuracy while you do. They can revise history without embarrassment. They can introduce new accusations mid-argument. They can abandon one line of attack and open another the moment the first one starts to fail. You cannot do any of these things without feeling that you have compromised your integrity. What you actually need to defend is not your argument, it is your clarity, your internal coherence, your sense of what you know to be true about your own experience and values. Machiavelli wrote about the danger of allowing others to define the terms on which you engage them. A ruler who always fights on ground chosen by the enemy has already surrendered a significant advantage before the first move is made. In the silent game, the manipulator is always trying to define the ground. They want the conversation to be about your reaction rather than their behavior, about your tone rather than their content, about whether you are being fair to them rather than whether they are being fair to you. Every time you accept this framing, you are fighting on their terrain. Protecting your clarity means learning to disengage from conversations that are structured to disorient rather than resolve, not with drama, not with announced withdrawal that becomes its own spectacle, but with the quiet, consistent practice of simply not continuing to engage with a frame that does not serve truth. Machiavelli described this not as weakness or avoidance, but as a form of strategic intelligence, the understanding that not every battle deserves your full resources, and that sometimes the most powerful move is to withdraw your attention from a dynamic that only functions when you are fully present and fully reactive within it. The third element is perhaps the most counterintuitive. It involves changing what you are optimizing for in interactions where you suspect the silent game is in play. Most intelligent people enter conversations optimizing for resolution. They want the conflict to end, the relationship to stabilize, the other person to feel heard, and the air to be cleared. These are genuinely good goals in a genuinely good faith dynamic. But in a manipulative dynamic, optimizing for resolution makes you permanently available for exploitation, because resolution is always just out of reach. There is always one more misunderstanding to address, one more wound to acknowledge, one more explanation to provide. The goalpost moves because the goal itself is not resolution. The goal is your continued engagement, your continued accountability, your continued presence in a dynamic where your energy is the resource being consumed. What Machiavelli would suggest optimizing for instead is something closer to what he called one's own orders, operating according to your own internal structure rather than constantly responding to the structure imposed by someone else's emotional volatility. This means asking a different set of questions in moments of conflict. Not just what does this person need from me right now, but what does this situation actually require of me given everything I have observed over time? Not just how do I resolve this moment, but what kind of person do I need to be across the full arc of this relationship to remain someone I recognize and respect.